Okay, so here we have two sharks, right? Let's look at them. Let's look at the external features first off. So the first thing I'd like for you to note is the counter shading. Right, so remember we were saying that counter shading is a strategy that a lot of aquatic animals show, where they are darker colored on the top. So a predator looking down sees a dark object against a dark substrate, and then on the underside they're lightly colored. So a predator looking up sees a light object against a light background. Right? So we see counter shading very predominant in the shark. Now, this shark has a torpedo, a fusiform body shape, which allows it to cut through the water very, very quickly. Right? Now, what we want to note as well, look at how flexible this body is. And this is because of the cartilaginous skeleton. So remember that sharks, skates, and rays belong to the group chondriichthyes, which are the cartilaginous fish, right? So these do not have bony skeletons. So anytime you go Maracas and you're getting your shark and bake and you get a big old piece of bone, know that you're not looking at actual shark, right? Some larger sharks will have calcification of the cartilage on their jaws and some of their fins just to make them more sturdy. So you might be able to see shark jaws on sale that appear to be bony, but that's not bone that is formed in the embryonic stage. That's when you have the calcification happening as the shark ages and gets older. Now, sharks do not have an operculum. They have a series of gill slits which are useful in identifying what species we're talking about. So similar to the fish, ventilation happens with the shark. As the shark swims forward, water enters the mouth and flows over the gills which lie under these gill slits. Right? And we have separation again of the respiratory system from the digestive system. And the importance of that is so that we do not have, you need to have speedy movement for the respiratory system. You need to have the water moving very quickly so you don't have stale water mixing over your respiratory surface. However, when it comes to digestion, you want to take your time and move slowly. So by separating the digestive system and the respiratory system, you have managed to have two different rates of processing in a single body, which allow for the maximum extraction of respiratory gases by the respiratory system and the maximum extraction of nutrient resources by the digestive system. And this is very important because, being a predator is a very difficult, metabolically expensive activity. So you don't want to go through the trouble of finding food, eating food, and breaking food down to have everything washed out of your body before you've extracted all of the resources. So by separating these two systems, we've allowed for greater efficiency, which leads to greater speed, greater adaptations as a motile animal, an active hunter and predator. Helping with this role as a hunter and predator as well, all of these little pores that you see on the surface of the shark, right, around the eyes, around the nares, right, all of these little circles, all of these little spots, they are actually sensory organs. They say that a shark can smell blood in the water from miles away. This is how the shark can scent different prey species in the water with these very, very efficient organs. Now, the teeth of a shark are also, they are adapted scales. That's one thing for us to know. And they occur in rows. And these teeth are sharp hooks. So when this shark captures a prey, if a tooth breaks out, there are more teeth in rows right behind, like little switchblades, ready to open out. Now, if you ever get a shark, and I would suggest that you think twice about it, because sharks are endangered. In fact, I have issued a moratorium on using sharks in labs because the fishery, the shark fishery in Trinidad, is not sustainably managed. I made an exception this year because we're going to preserve these guys for the rest of eternity, or at least for 10 to 15 years, so we can show students what the sharks look like, right? So to me, it was a decent sacrifice for something, a resource that we're going to keep on using. So I would not suggest that you go and buy sharks in order to dissect. But should you ever get the opportunity, if you run your finger over a shark like this, from head to tail, it feels smooth. But if you run your hand, and you could actually, let me do this close to the mic so you could hear. You can actually hear that it's rough. So the scales of a shark are not like a bony fish. They're not flat. They're actually shaped very much like the teeth, these tiny little backward curving bits of calcium carbonate, right, embedded in the skin, and that helps the shark to swim silently. They basically break up the water column, so water moves smoothly and silently over the shark. So basically, you're in the water, you're a fish, you're just swimming around, minding your own business, and all of a sudden, a shark just appears out of nowhere. Now, this shark skin, we actually have uses for it. If you're into sushi, the traditional grater that's used to make wasabi paste is a shark skin grater. So it's like if you look at some sushi chefs making the wasabi paste, they are actually using like a piece of shark skin nailed or stuck onto a piece of wood, and they rub the wasabi root, which looks a bit like ginger, on that shark skin and break it down into a paste. In a lot of the Eastern countries, in Japan and China, in a lot of these countries, they also use shark skin to make the holds, the part of the sword that you hold, the hilt. Yeah, so they make shark skin grips on swords. So when your hands are all slippery with the blood of your enemies, the sword isn't going to slip out of your grip, right? Because of the shark skin that's a bit rough. And if you're into Naruto, I think it's Kisame is the name of the character, the one with a massive sword that he had wrapped up in cloth, and then he would break it out and it's all rough. That is a shark skin sword. So they actually used to have shark skin swords or clubs that they would use to attack people as well. Okay, so those are some little uses of the shark. Now, one interesting thing about the shark as well is the shape of its tail. So remember, assuming we've looked at the video for the bony fish first, you might remember that we spoke about the swim bladder. We said that sharks do not have a swim bladder, so they have to keep constantly swimming. Now, what helps them to stay afloat is the shape of their tail. This tail is a heterocircle tail, right? Where it has a different shaped lobes above and below. And this helps to keep the shark balanced in such a way that it doesn't have to always swim up, right? It helps with the balance of the shark. Okay, so this shark here is a female. This one here is a male. How do I know? You look at the pelvic fin, right? So these are the pectoral fins, these are the pelvic fins, right? On the male, the pelvic fins have these cartilaginous structures called claspers, and these claspers hold the female in place while they're mating. If you look at the shape of the fin of the female, it's rounded. Okay? So, we're going to start cutting this guy open. So, we're going to cut into the male first off. As always, you start at the cloaca. Right? Remember, the cloaca is one opening for everything, for the reproductive system, excretory system, digestive system. So we're cutting through the pelvic girdle. Let me use the scalpel. Now, when we get this guy open, if I remember correctly, we're going to see a huge mass of liver, right? So the liver in sharks is usually really huge, partly because of their diet, partly because they store a lot of oils in their liver, which helps with their flotation, right? So I'm cutting through the skin here. Up between the pectoral girdle. And now I'm going to cut through the flesh. We have the cartilage of this girdle here, and cut through that. All right, here we go. So as you can see, I made a little boo-boo. I cut through the liver a little here. All right, I wasn't careful enough. Okay, so the shark. Let me just get a little distilled water in here. And let me clear around the gills a little. I will do is so I'm cutting this way so we can take a look at the gills. Right. So remember, in the bony fish, the gills have all been collapsed into a single chamber. Right? Here in the shark, each pair of gills is housed in its own slit, right? And water enters the mouth, flows over the gills. This here is the heart of the shark, right? You have a ventricle. The ventricle is very thick-walled. And then you have the softer atria up there. Right, so this ventricle has to be thick-walled in order to pump blood rapidly across the body, throughout the body of the shark. because the shark is going to, it's a very fast swimmer. It needs to be very, very fast swimming. Okay, so this cream colored lobular structure is the liver. Liver always looks like this. It always has this sharp edge. It always looks very smooth, right? So that's the liver. Again, the kidneys are a diffuse stripe against the spine in the back here, right? These are the gonads, and this is definitely a male because you're not seeing anything that looks like eggs, right? So those are the gonads that are going to be producing sperm for mating. And this here is the digestive system, the alimentary canal that opens into the cloaca, right? So you can see there's a lot of vascularization that allows for materials to be absorbed from the digestive system, right? The stomach. So let's look at it here. So you have a J-shaped stomach, right? Coming down the mouth, esophagus, stomach here. This would be the pancreas, right? And the stomach forms a J and then goes into this tube here. This is the colon, right? Coming down to the rectum, which has some soft, squishy digested material that I'm not going to be digging up in. Right? So quite simply, again, this is the viscera of the shark, right? All of this is body for rapid movement. And then we have the internal organs that run the entire operation. So I'm not going to pull anything out because I want to keep everything in situ as much as possible for preservation. So that was the male, right? And now we're talking about the female. Okay. So again, remember she has smooth claspers. Let me just get through the skin first. So again, sadly, sharks, even though they're absolutely delicious, I remember growing up, we used to get really big sharks at home, and that was the kind of meat that, the fish that mommy preferred to feed us because she didn't have to worry about bones, right? When you have 4 children, you can't sit and feed each one individually when you're feeding them fish. So shark was always an easy meat for her to feed us. But if you think of nowadays, the fish that you buy in the market compared to what you used to get long time, right? Fish now are smaller. They appear, it's not your imagination, they are smaller. It's not as common. You tend to find more fish that long time people really would turn up their noses at and wouldn't eat, or just say that's for the broth pot. And we tend to be eating a lot more of that now. And all of that is significant or signifies fisheries that are not being fully managed or appropriately managed. Right, so you see when you cut the scale open here, the first thing that pops out at you is liver. Right? And again, this is because the liver of the shark is storing a lot of oils that is going to help her to stay afloat. Okay. The cartilage between at the pectoral girdle is a little stiff. So again, her gills are behind the flesh of her gill slits. Right? You have her heart here with the thick-walled ventricle, the softer atria. When we crack open into her, we're seeing the large liver, this very, very large liver. Okay, we're seeing her J-shaped stomach beautifully. Right, these are her gonads, and if you look closely up here, you see one gonad is undeveloped, and this one here actually appears to have, okay, this has some embryos in it. Right, so I'm going to cut that open. It's very sad, but I'm going to cut it open. At least I hope I'm right and I'm not talking nonsense. I'm actually going to be quite happy if this is digestive stuff. But it isn't. We have some baby sharks. Doot to doot doot. Right? So you see that the shark, the baby shark, is actually attached to the mother, right? And the development of sharks is quite fascinating. I mean, some of them, there have been cases where they've recorded sharks in utero eating each other in utero. Right, so that was one of the, that was the uterus, and we have a baby. Again, it's really, really sad. Makes me unhappy. However, it's exciting for you all. All right. And in the back here again, we have the kidneys. Right? So remember, no swim bladder, because these guys, they need to be constantly swimming. Right. All right, so that's our dissection of the female shark. So hopefully by the time the apocalypse is over, at some point in your degree, I'm going to be able to bring the preserved versions of this out so you could take a look at them in real. Right?